Good evening, my friends. Wherever you are tonight, I want you to take a deep breath because what you're about to hear isn't just another headline from Africa. It's a story about pride, punishment, and power, and how one small nation just changed the rules of global diplomacy. The morning of October 10th, 2025 began like any other in Ouagadougou. The sun rose heavy and golden over the capital, motorbikes buzzed along dusty roads, students in clean white shirts queued outside the U.S. Embassy, clutching folders of dreams, student visas, business trips, medical permits. For years, those gates symbolized opportunity. And then, without warning, it ended. A new message flashed across the embassy's digital board. All routine visa services are suspended until further notice. No explanation, no apology, just silence from the nation that never misses a chance to preach transparency. Within hours, the queue was gone, and by noon, the story had consumed the city. People whispered, "Why, but diplomats don't act without reason." And soon, the truth emerged. The United States had asked Burkina Faso to accept deportees, people expelled under Donald Trump's renewed immigration purge. Washington called it humanitarian relocation. But Ouagadougou called it what it was: a demand to turn sovereign soil into a dumping ground. That's when Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government said no firmly, quietly, without apology. And America responded the only way empires know how: by closing its doors. So tonight we ask a question far greater than visas or politics. What happens when a small African nation decides that dignity matters more than access? Is this the birth of a new diplomacy, a diplomacy of defiance? If you believe that respect should never require permission, stay with us, because this story is about more than travel bans. It's about how freedom begins when silence turns into courage. The morning began with ordinary rhythm. The streets of Ouagadougou were alive with movement, vendors setting up their stalls, children walking to school, soldiers at checkpoints nodding to the passing traffic. Nothing suggested that by midday the nation would face one of the most symbolic diplomatic ruptures in its history. At 8:47 a.m., the U.S. Embassy quietly changed its notice board. The digital screen that once displayed travel schedules and visa appointments now bore a single message: all routine visa services are suspended until further notice. No flag at half-mast, no warning, just silence, the cold kind that follows deliberate power. By 9:00, the queue of hopeful travelers dissolved in confusion. Mothers who had waited weeks for medical interviews, students who had dreamed of universities abroad, entrepreneurs with conferences in Atlanta or New York. They all stared at the gate that now seemed less like an entrance and more like a wall. The embassy staff offered no explanation. One guard muttered something about technical issues, but diplomats don't close their doors without intent. Within hours, journalists began calling the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. By late morning, whispers turned into headlines. The truth was, Burkina Faso had rejected a U.S. proposal to host deportees, men and women expelled under Donald Trump's renewed immigration policy. Washington had framed it as a humanitarian relocation initiative. But in Ouagadougou, it felt like something else: an insult dressed as partnership. The U.S. wasn't asking for cooperation. It was offloading responsibility. It was asking a proud African nation to serve as a storage yard for people it no longer wanted. Inside the Presidential Council, the discussion was brief but decisive. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, known for his unwavering tone, refused to compromise. Burkina Faso, he said, will never be the world's dumping ground. That afternoon, the country's foreign minister, Jean-Marie Kamoko Traoré, addressed the nation in a live broadcast. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. His words carried the stillness of conviction. Burkina Faso is not a land of deportation. Our hospitality is not an excuse for others to offload their problems. Those 21 words shook the airwaves like thunder. Within minutes, the clip spread across social media and news channels across Africa. To some, it was diplomatic suicide. To others, it was moral clarity long overdue. For years, African nations had accepted arrangements cloaked as aid or relocation, only to discover that such deals often meant permanent dependency. Haiti had learned it. Honduras had lived it. Yet this time, an African government drew the line. By evening, the U.S. Embassy's lights were dim. Inside phones rang unanswered. Reporters seeking comments received the same phrase repeated in bureaucratic monotone: "This is a temporary technical adjustment." But no one believed it. Embassies don't close over paperwork. They close over pride. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, the streets buzzed with discussion. At tea stalls and radio stations, citizens debated the meaning of what had just happened. Some worried about the implications families' separated travel dreams postponed. But many, perhaps most, felt something stronger than fear pride. If they don't want us, said one university student on Radio Bobo, it means we've finally stopped begging for approval. That sentiment captured the national mood. The visa freeze wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a revelation. For decades, the American visa symbolized advancement legitimacy, the golden ticket of aspiration. But on that October morning, the illusion shattered. People realized that access granted by others could vanish in an instant. And behind that realization came a deeper question, one that transcended borders. If another country can close its doors overnight, how much of our freedom truly belongs to us? By the next day, murals appeared on city walls. One read, "Dignity is the new visa." Another showed a broken passport stamp with the words, "Burkina will not bend." It was no longer about visas. It was about vision. That week marked the moment Burkina Faso transitioned from obedience to ownership, not through war, but through words. A nation that once waited at the gates of others had finally built its own. The turning point came not with an explosion, but with a sentence. Burkina Faso is not a land of deportation. Those words, spoken calmly on national television by Foreign Minister Jean-Marie Kamoko Traore, traveled faster than any headline. Within an hour, they were echoing across radios from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Within a day, they were quoted in parliaments and classrooms across Africa. It wasn't just a statement, it was a mirror held up to centuries of unequal diplomacy, and the world reacted. Inside Washington, the tone turned icy. Officials avoided direct confrontation, but the message was unmistakable. There will be consequences. The embassy's visa freeze became the first act of quiet retaliation. American media outlets downplayed the story, calling it a temporary operational adjustment. But African journalists saw through it immediately. This wasn't about logistics, it was about leverage. Because in modern geopolitics, the visa has become what the whip once was, a tool of control masked as privilege. Whoever controls mobility, one analyst on Voice of Africa said, controls imagination. And that was the deeper wound. The United States didn't send soldiers or sanctions. It sent silence, the kind that isolates you socially, professionally, psychologically. The visa became the velvet rope of modern power, soft to the touch, hard to break. Students who once dreamed of studying in Boston or New York began to realize how fragile that dream was. Businessmen who built careers on international trade now found their connections frozen by politics they didn't choose. For the young and ambitious, the message was sharp. Your dignity comes at a cost. But something unexpected happened. Instead of despair, pride took root. Crowds gathered outside the closed embassy gates not to protest, but to photograph the moment the iron gates locked, the American flag still fluttering, the symbol of opportunity, now transformed into a monument of arrogance. Local radio stations replayed the foreign minister's speech on loop. Social media filled with messages of support. Burkina said no, Africa said enough, dignity before visas. Even those who once sought American visas began to feel the shift. One young entrepreneur wrote, "Maybe it's time they need us for once. Let's build something worth visiting." Across the Sahel, the ripple was immediate. In Bamako, Mali's youth movement called it a day of African awakening. In Niamey, Niger's state television praised Burkina Faso's courage, calling it the beginning of sovereignty diplomacy. By week's end, the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger released a joint communiqué supporting the decision. The statement was brief, but sharp. Sovereignty is not negotiable. Dignity is not for rent. It was the kind of declaration that used to come from Paris or Washington, not from the heart of Africa. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department kept its distance. No condemnation, no open confrontation, just the cold efficiency of bureaucracy. But behind the silence, frustration brewed. Washington had not expected resistance. For decades, Africa's political class had operated on compromise and compliance. Burkina Faso had broken the script, and yet in doing so, it awakened something larger than itself, a continental consciousness. African scholars began debating the idea of deportation diplomacy. Pan-African networks aired documentaries titled "The End of Obedience." On campuses in Accra and Nairobi, students recited Traore's line like a prayer, "We are not a land of deportation." Even within the diaspora in Atlanta, London, and Paris, African communities began holding solidarity gatherings. Speakers asked a simple but seismic question: if dignity costs access, are we ready to pay the price? That was the essence of the moment. The embassy's visa freeze was meant to discipline, but it did the opposite. It became a catalyst for pride. Because sometimes power doesn't collapse when it's opposed, it collapses when it's ignored. And that was exactly what Burkina Faso had done. It ignored the fear. It treated the United States not as a master, not as an adversary, but as an equal whose approval no longer defined its destiny. From that moment on, a new kind of diplomacy emerged in West Africa, not the diplomacy of dependence, but of defiance. The kind that doesn't need permission to stand tall. The days following the visa suspension felt strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that hides transformation beneath routine. Markets reopened, schools resumed, and traffic returned to its usual rhythm. But beneath that ordinary surface, something had shifted. For years, a visa to the United States had symbolized success. It meant you were worthy, educated, trusted by the world beyond your borders. But now, as embassy gates stood locked and silent, that illusion began to crumble. People started asking questions that had long been avoided. Why must opportunity come stamped by someone else's approval? Why should dignity depend on permission? What was once seen as an act of punishment had become a moment of awakening. Across Ouagadougou, university professors held open-air discussions about sovereignty. Radio stations replaced American pop music with local songs of resilience. Posters appeared on walls reading, "The door they closed is the door we no longer need." Inside the National Assembly, lawmakers spoke with a new confidence. One parliamentarian declared, "They closed their gates. Let us open ours." And in the following week, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government took a decision that would redefine mobility across the Sahel. Burkina Faso lifted all visa requirements for African citizens. It was a simple act, but its symbolism was revolutionary. Flights from Ghana, Niger, and Mali began arriving without restrictions. Traders, engineers, and students from across the continent walked through the same airport once crowded by foreign consultants. The message was clear. If others build walls, Africa will build bridges. That decision triggered a cascade of civil and political effects. Socially, the mood in the streets changed. Where fear had once lingered, pride now lived. Young people began speaking of building within rather than escaping outward. Local entrepreneurs started new ventures aimed at serving regional markets, from textile workshops to agricultural co-ops. The idea of success began to shift from leaving Africa to improving it. Politically, Traoré's leadership gained unprecedented legitimacy. His defiance of Washington resonated deeply with a generation that had grown up watching their leaders bow. Now, for the first time, they saw one who refused, and did so with dignity, not hostility. The phrase "our soil is not for sale" became a rallying cry, chanted in student protests and printed on T-shirts. In diplomatic circles, the move forced conversations once considered unthinkable. Could Africa define its own mobility system? Could regional alliances replace dependency on Western visas and funding? Within weeks, the Alliance of Sahel States began drafting a framework for a Pan-African travel agreement, allowing citizens of member states to move, work, and trade freely. Burkina Faso had not only rejected a foreign demand, it had set off a continental reform. At the same time, local civil society organizations began documenting how the visa freeze exposed a deeper psychological dependency, a belief that progress was external, not internal. Workshops and town hall meetings reframed the narrative. We don't need permission to be great. Even the nation's artists joined in. In Ouagadougou's Central Plaza, a mural appeared depicting an open passport burning into light with the words, "Dignity doesn't expire." It became the most photographed wall in the country. Still, the government knew symbolism alone was not enough. Traoré emphasized action, expanding gold refinery facilities to keep profits in country, launching youth employment programs tied to national industries, strengthening education focused on science and technology, the tools of independence. Each measure sent the same message: sovereignty is not a speech, it's a system. By the end of that month, Burkina Faso no longer felt like a nation punished by isolation, it felt like a nation purified by it. Because sometimes the gates that close from outside are the ones that force a country to finally open from within. From Washington's perspective, it was supposed to be a small disciplinary measure, a way to remind an uncooperative government who still held the keys. But diplomacy is never as controlled as its architects imagine. When the United States froze visas for Burkina Faso, it didn't weaken the Sahel, it weakened its own myth. The world noticed. European analysts called it a miscalculated response. On Al Jazeera, one commentator put it more bluntly, America forgot that Africa has stopped kneeling. For decades, the United States projected its influence through access scholarships, trade programs, development grants, and of course, visas. It was soft power wrapped in benevolence. But when that access turned into punishment, the illusion cracked. The same instrument once seen as a bridge began to look like a cage. In Washington, few wanted to admit it. The official narrative remained bureaucratic technical suspension. But beyond the press releases, policymakers quietly realized that something far larger had shifted. Africa no longer reacted with fear. The embassy's closure triggered what one diplomat described as a continental mirror moment. Nations from Ghana to Tanzania began reviewing their own bilateral migration agreements. Editorials in Nairobi and Abuja questioned why African passports required such constant validation from foreign hands. Even leaders traditionally loyal to the West began speaking in the language of reciprocity. If you restrict us, we can restrict you. Meanwhile, outside Africa, the balance of partnerships evolved almost overnight. Russia, China, Turkey, and India each extended offers of cooperation. Scholarships, investment packages, and industrial deals began flowing into Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, with one crucial difference: they came without lectures. While Washington viewed mobility as leverage, Moscow saw it as opportunity. Beijing framed it as infrastructure, Ankara as faith. In a matter of months, the soft power map of Africa began to redraw itself. The irony, of course, was staggering. The United States, a nation built by immigrants once defined by open horizons, had turned immobility into policy. It had weaponized what once defined its greatness movement. For many Americans, especially those old enough to remember the ideals of Kennedy and King, the news from Burkina Faso sounded distant, almost trivial. But beneath it lies a profound question about America's own moral compass. What happens when the land of the free begins to fear those who seek freedom elsewhere? In Africa, that question was no longer rhetorical. The continent that once begged for visas was now building alternatives. Economic corridors between West and East Africa, educational partnerships with Asia, military cooperation within the AES alliance, a sense of self-sufficiency that no longer waited for Western approval. And so, in the grand theater of geopolitics, the roles have quietly reversed. The same nations once labeled developing are now developing new systems of dignity. And the powers once seen as advanced are discovering how fragile their influence becomes when they mistake respect for control. For the first time in generations, the world is watching Africa not as a stage of crisis, but as a teacher of principle. Because what began as a visa ban has become something much greater, a mirror held up to the West. And in that reflection, America must now decide, does it still lead by example or merely by exclusion? History rarely announces its turning points. They arrive quietly, a speech on television, a signature on a document, a gate that suddenly closes. Yet in those small moments, the course of nations shifts. When the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou shut its doors, it did more than suspend visas. It suspended illusion. It reminded the world that dependency wears a polite face and that true freedom is rarely granted, it must be claimed. Burkina Faso's defiance was not born of arrogance. It was born of fatigue, the exhaustion of being told what partnership should mean, what democracy should look like, and what humility should cost. In saying no, the nation said something far deeper. We have nothing left to trade except our dignity, and that we will never sell. But this story is not about Burkina Faso alone. It is about the awakening of a continent, one realizing that every denial from abroad is an invitation to build within. The visa freeze meant to punish has become a catalyst. Across the Sahel, nations are learning that the road to sovereignty is not paved with foreign approval, but with self-definition. Still, this new era carries its own warning. Every revolution that breaks chains must beware of forging new ones. As Africa partners with Russia, China, and others, the lesson of history must not be forgotten. Independence is not about who helps you, but about who cannot own you. True power lies not in alliances, but in balance. And so we arrive at a simple truth, one that echoes from Ouagadougou to Washington. Freedom is not achieved by fighting for entry. Freedom begins when you become the destination. That is what Ibrahim Traoré and his people are building, a new model of sovereignty that measures progress not by imitation, but by integrity. Tonight, as you listen to these words, ask yourself, has the time come for Africa to stop asking for permission and start defining the world on its own terms? Can dignity, once reclaimed, reshape global power itself? If you believe that the answer is yes, then you are already part of this awakening. Please share this message if you stand with those who choose pride over permission. Subscribe if you believe that the truth deserves more than headlines, it deserves history. Because someday, when future generations look back, they will not remember the day the U.S. closed its doors. They will remember the day Africa stopped knocking.